On January 30th, 1649, King Charles I of England stepped through a window of the banqueting house in London and walked onto a wooden scaffold built specifically for his execution. He wore 2 shirts that morning, even though it was bitterly cold, because he was terrified that the crowd would see him shiver and mistake his trembling for fear. The king had spent the night praying and preparing himself for death, refusing to sleep more than a few hours because, as he told his attendant, he had a great work to do this day. When he emerged onto the scaffold, he found himself surrounded by soldiers and a vast crowd that had gathered to witness something unprecedented in English history: the public execution of an anointed monarch by his own subjects. Charles looked down at the sea of faces, some weeping, some jeering, most simply stunned into silence by the enormity of what was about to happen, and he prepared to deliver his final words. The speech he gave was defiant to the last, insisting that he died a martyr for the people's liberties, even as the people's representatives prepared to cut off his head. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," Charles declared. "Where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." He then tucked his hair under a white satin cap, laid his neck on the block, and stretched out his arms as the signal for the executioner to strike. The axe fell once, cleanly, and the head of the King of England dropped into a basket while the crowd let out a collective groan that witnesses described as the strangest and saddest sound they had ever heard. England had done the unthinkable. It had put its king on trial, convicted him of treason against his own people, and executed him like a common criminal in front of the very palace where he had once held court. And that wasn't even the strangest part, because the same people who killed the king would also ban Christmas, close the theaters, and attempt to remake English society according to their vision of godly reformation. For 11 years, England would be a republic, ruled not by a king, but by a military dictator who called himself Lord Protector, surrounded by Puritan zealots who believed they were building God's kingdom on earth. This is the story of how England went from being a monarchy to cutting off its king's head, from celebrating Christmas to banning it, and from fearing God to fearing the government that claimed to act in God's name. It's a story of religious fanaticism, political miscalculation, and the eternal struggle between liberty and authority that still shapes our world today. To understand how England could execute its king, you need to understand the man himself, because Charles I was not merely unlucky, he was catastrophically unsuited for the challenges he faced. Charles was born in 1600, the second son of King James I of England and VI of Scotland, a sickly child who was not expected to survive, let alone inherit the throne. His older brother Henry, Prince of Wales, was everything Charles was not: tall, athletic, charismatic, and universally beloved as the perfect model of a Renaissance prince. When Henry died suddenly of typhoid fever in 1612, the 12-year-old Charles found himself heir to 3 kingdoms he had never expected to rule, and he would spend his life trying to prove himself worthy of a crown that should have been his brother's. Charles overcame the physical weaknesses of his childhood through sheer determination, transforming himself into an accomplished horseman and developing a dignified bearing that impressed foreign visitors, even if it struck his subjects as cold and aloof. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply religious, with a genuine appreciation for art and architecture that would make his court one of the most sophisticated in Europe. But Charles had fatal flaws that would destroy him. He was stubborn beyond reason, incapable of genuine compromise, and absolutely convinced that God had appointed him to rule, and that any opposition to his will was therefore opposition to divine order. He believed in the divine right of kings with an intensity that would seem excessive even by the standards of his age, viewing Parliament not as a partner in government, but as an obstacle to be overcome or bypassed whenever it suited his purposes. Charles also had a terrible judge of character, consistently promoting favorites who gave him bad advice while alienating potential allies who might have helped him navigate the treacherous waters of 17th century politics. His marriage to the French Catholic princess Henrietta Maria, while personally happy, was politically disastrous, feeding Protestant fears that the king was secretly sympathetic to Rome and intended to restore Catholicism to England. These personal qualities might not have mattered in a more stable era, but Charles inherited a kingdom in crisis, facing challenges that would have tested even the wisest and most flexible of rulers. The England that Charles I inherited in 1625 was a powder keg of religious, political, and economic tensions that had been building since his father's reign and would explode during his own. The Protestant Reformation had divided English society into factions that disagreed not just about theology, but about the very nature of the church, the state, and the proper relationship between them. At one extreme were Catholics, still a significant minority despite decades of persecution, who looked to Rome for spiritual authority and were viewed by most Protestants as traitors loyal to a foreign power. At the other extreme were Puritans, fervent Protestants who believed the English Reformation had not gone far enough and who wanted to purify the Church of England of what they saw as lingering Catholic corruptions. The Puritans objected to elaborate church ceremonies, clerical vestments, religious art, and music, the hierarchical structure of the church with its bishops and archbishops, and what they saw as the worldly corruption of the clergy. They wanted a simpler, more austere form of worship focused on preaching and Bible study, with churches governed by their own congregations rather than by bishops appointed by the king. The Puritans were especially strong in London and the commercial towns of southeastern England, where merchants and professionals had the education and independence to form their own religious opinions. They were also heavily represented in Parliament, particularly in the House of Commons, where their influence far exceeded their numbers in the general population. King James I had managed to balance these factions through a combination of theological flexibility, political cunning, and an instinctive understanding of how far he could push before provoking resistance. Charles I lacked all of these qualities, and his religious policies would unite Puritans against him more effectively than any deliberate persecution could have achieved. The religious conflict that would eventually tear England apart centered on a seemingly obscure theological dispute about the nature of salvation and the proper form of church worship. Charles I was attracted to a movement within the Church of England known as Arminianism, which emphasized the beauty of worship, the importance of ceremony, and the role of the clergy as intermediaries between God and the people. Arminians believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which required treating the communion table as a sacred altar rather than an ordinary piece of furniture. They favored elaborate church decoration, including stained glass, religious images, and ornate vestments that Puritans considered popish superstitions. Most controversially, Arminians rejected the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, which held that God had already determined who would be saved and who would be damned before they were even born. Puritans considered predestination a fundamental doctrine of Protestant theology, and they viewed its rejection as evidence that the Arminians were secret Catholics trying to smuggle Rome back into England through the back door. Charles appointed William Laud, the most aggressive and uncompromising of the Arminian bishops, as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633, giving him authority to impose his vision on the entire English Church. Laud used his power to silence Puritan preachers, destroy their printing presses, and mutilate those who published attacks on his policies, cutting off their ears, branding their faces, and imprisoning them indefinitely. He ordered that communion tables be moved from the nave to the east end of churches and railed off like Catholic altars, a change that symbolized everything Puritans hated about his religious program. Puritan ministers who refused to conform were expelled from their parishes, driving some into exile in the Netherlands or New England and radicalizing others who remained behind. The religious persecution of the 1630s created a generation of bitter enemies who would remember what had been done to them and their communities when the opportunity for revenge finally came. The political conflict that paralleled the religious crisis centered on the question of whether Parliament had any meaningful role in governing England or whether the king could rule without it. Parliament's power derived primarily from its control over taxation. The king could not levy new taxes without Parliament's consent, which gave Parliament leverage to demand redress of grievances before voting the money the crown needed. Charles I's father, James I, had clashed with Parliament repeatedly over money and prerogative, but he had always found ways to compromise and avoid a complete breakdown. Charles was less willing to compromise, and his financial demands were more urgent because England was embroiled in expensive and unsuccessful wars against Spain and France during the first years of his reign. When Parliament refused to grant him sufficient funds and attached conditions to what they did grant, Charles dissolved Parliament and attempted to raise money through other means. He revived ancient feudal dues that had not been collected for generations, imposed fines on gentlemen who refused the dubious honor of knighthood, and sold monopolies to favored courtiers who then gouged consumers for necessities like soap. The most controversial of his extra-parliamentary revenues was ship money, a traditional levy on coastal towns for naval defense that Charles extended to inland counties and collected annually as a permanent tax. Ship money was efficient and raised substantial sums, but it was also clearly illegal by any honest reading of English law. And its collection without parliamentary consent struck at the fundamental principle that the king could not tax without the people's representatives' approval. A country gentleman named John Hampden refused to pay ship money and was prosecuted in a test case that became a cause célèbre, with crowds filling the courtroom to watch the judges narrowly rule in the king's favor. The ship money case convinced many English men that their liberties were under systematic attack by a king who would stop at nothing to make himself an absolute monarch on the model of continental despots. Charles I ruled without Parliament for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, a period known as the Personal Rule or, to his critics, the 11 Years' Tyranny. During these years, Charles presided over an increasingly efficient and oppressive government that collected revenues, enforced religious conformity, and punished dissent with growing effectiveness. The Star Chamber, a prerogative court that operated without juries and could impose any punishment short of death, became the instrument of royal vengeance against critics and dissenters. William Preen, a Puritan lawyer who wrote a massive attack on stage plays that was interpreted as an insult to the Queen, had his ears cropped in the pillory and was imprisoned indefinitely. When he continued to write from prison, he was brought back to the pillory to have the stumps of his ears burned off and his cheeks branded with the letters SL for seditious libeler. Others who challenged the religious policies of the crown suffered similar fates, their mutilated bodies serving as warnings to anyone who might consider following their example. The silence that descended on English public life during the Personal Rule was not consent but fear, and beneath the surface, resentment was building that would eventually burst forth with explosive violence. Many Puritans despaired of England entirely, emigrating to New England where they could worship freely and build the godly commonwealth that seemed impossible under Charles's rule. Those who remained behind nurtured their grievances and waited for the opportunity to strike back at a king they increasingly saw not as God's anointed, but as a tyrant betraying his sacred trust. The opportunity came in 1637, when Charles made the catastrophic decision to impose his religious vision on Scotland, a separate kingdom that he had barely visited and did not understand. Scotland had embraced Protestantism more thoroughly than England, adopting a Presbyterian system of church government that rejected bishops entirely in favor of rule by assemblies of ministers and elders. Scottish Presbyterians regarded bishops as a popish corruption of true Christianity, and they viewed the English ceremonies that Charles wanted to impose as little better than Catholic idolatry. When Charles ordered the use of a new prayer book based on the English Book of Common Prayer in Scottish churches, the reaction was immediate and violent. At St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh on July 23, 1637, a woman named Jenny Geddes allegedly threw her stool at the minister's head when he began reading from the new liturgy, shouting "false thief." Do you say Mass at my ear? Whether the story is literally true or not, it captures the fury that swept through Scotland as ordinary people rose up against what they saw as an attempt to destroy their religion and subject them to English tyranny. Within months, Scottish nobles, ministers, and commoners had united to sign the National Covenant, a document pledging resistance to the religious innovations and binding the signatories to defend each other against any who would impose them. The Covenanters, as they became known, formed a government, raised an army, and essentially rebelled against their king, while insisting that they remained loyal subjects opposing only his evil advisors. Charles gathered an army to crush the rebellion, but his forces were poorly trained, poorly supplied, and poorly motivated compared to the Scottish veterans who opposed them. The First Bishops' War of 1639 ended without a significant battle, as Charles's army proved incapable of fighting, and the king was forced to negotiate a humiliating truce. The Scottish crisis forced Charles to do what he had avoided for 11 years: summon Parliament to ask for money to fund a war. The Short Parliament of April 1640 demonstrated that 11 years of personal rule had not reconciled the English political nation to Charles's style of government. Instead of voting money for the Scottish War, Parliament insisted on debating grievances, ship money, religious persecution, arbitrary imprisonment that Charles considered closed questions not open for discussion. After just 3 weeks, Charles dissolved the Short Parliament without obtaining any money, determined to fight the Scots with whatever resources he could scrape together. The result was the Second Bishops' War, an even greater humiliation than the first, as the Scottish army invaded England, routed the king's forces at Newburn, and occupied the northern counties. The Scots demanded payment for their army's expenses and refused to leave until they received it, forcing Charles into a position where he had no choice but to summon another parliament. The Long Parliament, which met in November 1640, would sit in various forms for the next 20 years, transforming England more radically than any previous assembly in its history. Unlike the Short Parliament, the Long Parliament could not be dissolved at the king's pleasure because the Scots were still occupying northern England and would remain there until their demands were met. This gave Parliament unprecedented leverage over the king, and they used it to systematically dismantle the apparatus of personal rule that Charles had built over the previous decade. The Earl of Strafford, Charles's most capable and ruthless minister, was impeached, tried, and executed on charges of treason for his role in governing Ireland with an iron hand. Archbishop Laud was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he would remain for years before eventually following Strafford to the scaffold. The Star Chamber was abolished, ship money was declared illegal, and the king was forced to agree that Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. For a brief moment in 1641, it seemed possible that England might achieve a constitutional settlement that would satisfy both king and Parliament, preserving the monarchy while limiting its power. Charles agreed to most of Parliament's demands, at least in public, while privately plotting to find some way to reverse his concessions and restore his authority. The problem was trust. After years of duplicity, broken promises, and arbitrary government, Parliament simply did not believe that Charles would honor any agreement once the immediate pressure was removed. Events in Ireland would destroy whatever chance remained for peaceful settlement, as a Catholic uprising in October 1641 confronted England with a crisis that exposed the fundamental impossibility of compromise between king and Parliament. The Irish Catholics, fearing that the newly assertive English Parliament would impose even harsher anti-Catholic measures, rose in rebellion and attacked Protestant settlers, killing thousands in massacres that were exaggerated in the retelling. Reports reached England claiming that hundreds of thousands of Protestants had been murdered by Catholic savages, inflaming anti-Catholic sentiment and creating pressure for military intervention. But raising an army to suppress the Irish rebellion raised a terrifying question. Could Parliament trust Charles with an army when he might use it not against Irish Catholics, but against his English opponents? The Grand Remonstrance of November 1641 summarized all of Parliament's grievances against the king and demanded that he appoint only ministers whom Parliament trusted, essentially stripping him of control over his own government. The Remonstrance passed the House of Commons by only 11 votes, revealing how divided Parliament itself had become between those who wanted to continue pressing the king and those who feared the consequences of pushing too far. Charles, sensing that his moment had come, decided to strike back by arresting his leading opponents in Parliament for treason. On January 4th, 1642, Charles I entered the House of Commons with an armed guard, intending to arrest 5 members of Parliament: John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Haselrig, Denzil Hollis, and William Strode, whom he accused of treasonous correspondence with the Scots. It was the first and last time a reigning monarch would enter the Commons chamber, and the spectacle of armed soldiers in the heart of Parliament confirmed every fear about the king's intentions. The 5 members had been warned and had already fled to the safety of the City of London, leaving Charles to search the benches in vain for his intended victims. "I see all the birds are flown," Charles said lamely, before retreating in humiliation as members sat in stony silence, refusing to help him locate his enemies. The attempted arrest was a catastrophic miscalculation that united London against the king and convinced many waverers that Charles could not be trusted with power. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Privilege, privilege." In defense of Parliament, and Charles fled London with his family, never to return as a free man. Over the following months, both sides gathered forces and issued declarations justifying their actions, while moderates desperately sought compromise and ordinary people wondered whether civil war had become inevitable. Parliament demanded control of the militia, the appointment of royal ministers, and supervision of the religious settlement demands that Charles rejected as incompatible with monarchy itself. "If I granted your demands," Charles told a parliamentary delegation, "I should be no more than the mere phantom of a king." By August 1642, both sides had raised armies, and the king raised his standard at Nottingham, the traditional signal that he was calling his loyal subjects to arms against those who had rebelled against him. The English Civil War began not with a bang, but with confusion, as neither side was fully prepared for the conflict they had stumbled into, and many people still hoped for a negotiated settlement that would prevent actual bloodshed. The first major battle of the war, fought at Edge Hill in Warwickshire on October 23, 1642, demonstrated that both armies were poorly trained, badly coordinated, and uncertain about what they were actually fighting for beyond vague appeals to God, liberty, and the ancient Constitution. The Royalist cavalry, led by the king's dashing nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, charged with reckless bravery and scattered the parliamentary horse, but then pursued the fleeing enemy for miles instead of turning to attack the exposed parliamentary infantry. Meanwhile, the parliamentary infantry held their ground against the royalist foot soldiers, and when evening fell, both armies remained on the field, each convinced that they had won while neither had achieved anything decisive. Edgehill set the pattern for the first phase of the war: inconclusive battles, missed opportunities, and a grinding struggle for control of territory that neither side could win quickly or cleanly. The king established his headquarters at Oxford, where the university town became the center of royalist administration, while Parliament controlled London, the southeast, and the navy, which gave them access to customs, revenues, and foreign trade. The geographical division roughly followed religious and economic lines. The more Puritan, commercial, and urbanized South and East supported Parliament, while the more traditional, agricultural, and hierarchical North and West supported the king. But the lines were never clean, and both sides found supporters and opponents in every region, as families and communities divided against themselves over questions of loyalty, religion, and political principle. The war was fought not only between the two main armies, but in countless local conflicts, as garrisons fought for control of towns, castles, and strategic crossroads, and as neighbor turned against neighbor in bitter personal feuds wrapped in the language of national crisis. The parliamentary cause initially struggled because its leadership was divided and its military commanders were cautious, aristocratic, and often half-hearted in their commitment to defeating the king they still hoped to reconcile with. The Earl of Essex, Parliament's Lord General, was a decent man and an experienced soldier, but he fought the war as if he expected it to end in negotiation rather than total victory, missing opportunities and avoiding the aggressive action that might have ended the conflict quickly. Oliver Cromwell, a middle-aged gentleman farmer from Cambridgeshire who had been an undistinguished member of Parliament before the war, recognized the problem and began building a different kind of army to address it. Cromwell recruited soldiers based on their religious conviction rather than their social status, arguing that a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows was worth more than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else. His cavalry regiment, known as the Ironsides, became famous for their discipline, their ferocity in battle, and their ability to rally and charge again after breaking the enemy unlike Prince Rupert's cavaliers, who scattered in pursuit of plunder and glory. Cromwell combined military professionalism with religious enthusiasm, creating soldiers who believed they were doing God's work and who maintained strict discipline because they feared divine judgment more than any earthly punishment. The Ironsides did not drink, did not swear, did not plunder, and did not run away. They prayed before battle, sang psalms during the fighting, and gave thanks to God for victory with a fervor that terrified their enemies. Cromwell's success on the battlefield gave him influence in Parliament, where he emerged as the leader of those who wanted to fight the war to a finish rather than seeking a negotiated settlement with a king they no longer trusted. The alliance between military effectiveness and religious radicalism that Cromwell represented would transform England more profoundly than either the king or the original parliamentary leaders had ever imagined. The turning point of the war came in 1644, when Parliament allied with the Scottish Covenanters, who sent a substantial army south in exchange for promises that England would adopt Presbyterian church government. The combined parliamentary and Scottish forces met the main Royalist army at Marston Moor near York on July 2, 1644, in the largest battle ever fought on English soil, involving perhaps 45,000 soldiers on both sides. The battle began late in the evening as a sudden thunderstorm cleared and the parliamentary forces launched a surprise attack while the Royalists were preparing their supper. Cromwell's cavalry smashed through the Royalist horse on one wing, then wheeled around to attack the Royalist infantry from behind while the Scots pressed from the front. By nightfall, the Royalist army of the north had ceased to exist. 4,000 dead, 1,500 captured, and the survivors scattered across the Yorkshire countryside, too demoralized and disorganized to fight again. Marston Moor was the greatest parliamentary victory of the war, but it was not immediately followed up because the parliamentary commanders disagreed about strategy and the alliance with the Scots was already showing signs of strain. The Scots wanted Presbyterian uniformity. Many in the parliamentary army wanted religious toleration for the various Protestant sects that had proliferated during the chaos of war. And these incompatible visions would eventually tear the victorious alliance apart. Meanwhile, the king's forces in the south remained intact, and the war dragged on through 1644 and into 1645, with neither side able to deliver the knockout blow that would end the conflict. Parliament needed a new kind of army if it was going to win the war outright, and in the spring of 1645, they created one. The New Model Army, established by Parliament in February 1645, was the first truly professional national army in English history, organized on principles that Cromwell had pioneered with his Ironsides. Unlike the earlier parliamentary forces, which were regional armies commanded by aristocrats with varying degrees of competence and commitment, the new model was a unified national force with a single command structure and standardized organization. Officers were appointed based on ability rather than social rank, which meant that talented men of humble origins could rise to positions of command that would have been unthinkable in traditional armies. The soldiers were regularly paid, decently fed, and strictly disciplined, which eliminated the need for plunder that had made other armies so destructive to the civilian population. Religious enthusiasm permeated the new model, with soldiers and officers alike convinced that they were fighting for God's cause and that victory would be a sign of divine favor. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed Lord General, a capable and respected commander, but everyone understood that Oliver Cromwell, who served as Lieutenant General of Horse, was the driving force behind the army's effectiveness. The new model's first major engagement came at Naseby on June 14, 1645, where they faced the main Royalist army under King Charles himself in a battle that would effectively decide the war. The king had roughly 9,000 men. Fairfax and Cromwell had about 14,000, but numbers alone did not determine the outcome of 17th century battles, as Edgehill and other engagements had demonstrated. What determined the outcome at Naseby was discipline. When Cromwell's cavalry broke the Royalist horse on one wing, they did not scatter in pursuit, but rallied and attacked the Royalist infantry from behind, just as they had done at Marston Moor. The Royalist army was destroyed, with 5,000 prisoners taken and the king's personal baggage captured, including correspondence that revealed his efforts to bring foreign Catholic troops to England, a propaganda disaster that confirmed parliamentary claims about his treachery. After Naseby, the Royalist cause was doomed, though the king refused to acknowledge defeat, and the war dragged on for another year as parliamentary forces reduced Royalist strongholds one by one. Oxford finally surrendered in June 1646, and Charles, who had fled the city in disguise, gave himself up to the Scottish army at Newark, hoping to play the Scots against the English Parliament. The king spent the next 2 years as a prisoner, first of the Scots and then of Parliament, while various factions competed to determine the terms on which he might be restored to power. Charles was a master of duplicity who told each faction what they wanted to hear while secretly plotting to play them against each other and escape with his power intact. He negotiated with Parliament while secretly corresponding with the Scots. He promised religious concessions he never intended to keep. He encouraged his supporters to plan risings while pretending to accept his situation. Parliament was divided between Presbyterians, who wanted a negotiated settlement with the king and a national Presbyterian church, and independents, who wanted religious toleration and were increasingly skeptical that any settlement with Charles could be trusted. The new model army itself had become a political force, with soldiers forming councils to articulate their grievances and their vision for the settlement of the kingdom. The Levelers, a radical movement within the army and beyond, demanded democratic reforms including a vastly expanded franchise, written constitutional guarantees of rights, and religious toleration for all Protestants. At the Putney debates in October 1647, officers and elected soldier representatives argued about fundamental questions of political philosophy, with Colonel Thomas Rainsborough declaring that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. These debates revealed how far the Revolution had traveled from its origins as a defense of traditional parliamentary privileges to a challenge to the entire hierarchical structure of English society. The political crisis came to a head in 1648, when the king's secret dealings with the Scots finally bore fruit in the form of a second civil war. Charles had promised the Scots that he would establish Presbyterian church government in England for 3 years if they invaded on his behalf, and despite their previous alliance with Parliament, the Scots were desperate enough to believe him. A Scottish army crossed the border in July 1648, while Royalist risings erupted across England and Wales, threatening to undo everything Parliament had won in the First War. Cromwell crushed the Scottish invasion at the Battle of Preston in August, routing an army of 20,000 with a force half that size and demonstrating once again the superiority of the new model over all opponents. The risings in England and Wales were suppressed with equal efficiency, and by the autumn of 1648, the king's cause was more hopeless than ever, his last desperate gamble having achieved nothing but additional bloodshed. The Second Civil War transformed attitudes toward the king among the godly soldiers of the new model army, who now saw Charles not merely as a defeated enemy, but as a man of blood whose treachery had caused the deaths of thousands. A petition from the army demanded that the king be brought to justice as the capital and grand author of our troubles, and Cromwell, who had once hoped for a settlement with Charles, now concluded that God had spoken through the battlefield victories. Providence and necessity had determined that there could be no peace with a king who would never accept constitutional limitations and who would always plot to recover absolute power, regardless of what promises he might make. The army was now determined to bring the king to trial, but Parliament, still dominated by Presbyterians who wanted a negotiated settlement, refused to cooperate with what they saw as a dangerous and unprecedented act. On December 6, 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride stationed his soldiers at the entrance to the House of Commons and arrested or excluded approximately 140 members who were known to favor continued negotiations with the king. Pride's purge, as this coup was called, reduced Parliament to a rump of perhaps 200 members who were willing to proceed against the king, though even many of these had doubts about the legality and wisdom of what was being proposed. The legal obstacles to trying the king were formidable, since there was no court in England with jurisdiction over the sovereign and no law under which he could be charged. The traditional doctrine held that the king could do no wrong because all justice flowed from the crown. To put the king on trial was therefore a logical impossibility, like asking a man to serve as judge in his own case. Parliament solved this problem by simply creating a new court and declaring that it had jurisdiction, cutting through centuries of legal precedent with the blunt instrument of revolutionary necessity. The High Court of Justice, as it was styled, consisted of 135 commissioners appointed by the Rump Parliament, though only about 70 ever actually participated in the proceedings. Many prominent figures refused to serve, including Lord Fairfax, the commander of the new model army, whose wife would famously interrupt the trial to shout that Oliver Cromwell was a traitor. The charge against Charles was unprecedented. He was accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, who had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented. This was a revolutionary doctrine that placed the people's representatives above the king and held the monarch accountable for crimes against the nation he was supposed to serve. Charles understood exactly what was at stake, and he determined to use his trial not as a legal defense, but as a political statement about the illegitimacy of the entire proceeding. When the trial opened on January 20, 1649, in Westminster Hall, the king refused to remove his hat, refused to enter a plea, and refused to recognize the court's authority to try an anointed monarch. The trial of Charles I was a drama in which both sides played their roles with full awareness that history was watching and that the outcome would shape how future generations understood what had happened. Charles argued that by placing the king on trial, Parliament was destroying the fundamental liberties of England that he had supposedly violated, since the rights of English men depended on the ancient constitution that the crown embodied. If power without law may make laws, may alter the fundamental laws of the kingdom, I do not know what subject he is in England that can be sure of his life or anything that he calls his own, the king declared with unexpected eloquence. The court's president, John Bradshaw, responded that the king was being tried in the name of the people of England, of which you are elected king, a formulation that implied the revolutionary doctrine that royal authority derived from popular consent. Charles mockingly pointed out that he had never been elected by anyone, but the deeper issue was not historical accuracy, it was who had the power to define political legitimacy in a revolutionary situation. The trial lasted a week, with Charles consistently refusing to plead and the court proceeding to hear evidence and render judgment despite his non-cooperation. On January 27, 1649, the court found Charles guilty of high treason and sentenced him to death by the severing of his head from his body. 59 of the commissioners signed the death warrant, their names inscribed in history as the men who killed a king, and many of them would pay for their signatures with their lives after the monarchy was restored. Charles was given 3 days to prepare for death, during which he said goodbye to his children, burned his papers, and made his peace with God through prayer and the ministrations of his chaplain. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles walked through the banqueting house, passing beneath the magnificent ceiling paintings by Rubens that celebrated the divine right of his father, and stepped onto the scaffold where he would die. The execution of Charles I shocked Europe and divided English opinion in ways that would shape politics for generations. To the king's supporters, Charles became a martyr, a saint who had died for his faith and his principles, betrayed by ungodly rebels who had destroyed the ancient constitution of England. The book Icon Basilicae, purportedly written by Charles himself, and published within days of his death, presented the king as a suffering Christ figure and became an instant bestseller that influenced public opinion against the regicides. To the revolution's supporters, Charles was a tyrant who had received the just punishment for his crimes, a man of blood whose death was demanded by God's own providence as revealed in the military victories of the righteous. The deeper significance of the execution was the assertion that no one was above the law, that kings could be held accountable for their actions, and that the people, or at least their self-appointed representatives, had the right to judge and punish their rulers. This was a revolutionary principle that monarchs throughout Europe recognized as a mortal threat to their own power, which is why the execution was so universally condemned by foreign courts. England had done something unprecedented, something that challenged the entire political order of Christendom, and the question was whether the new regime that emerged from the revolution could survive and justify itself. The immediate task was constructing a new government for a kingdom that had always been a monarchy and that now found itself without a king. In May 1649, Parliament abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords, declaring England to be a commonwealth governed by the people's representatives in the House of Commons. The new republic faced enemies on every side: royalists in exile, the Scottish Covenanters, who had proclaimed Charles's son as King Charles II, Irish Catholics who had been in revolt since 1641, and a hostile Europe that viewed the regicides as criminals and blasphemers. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant figure in the new Commonwealth, not through any formal title, but through his control of the army and his reputation as God's chosen instrument for the reformation of England. His first task was the conquest of Ireland, where a royalist Catholic alliance controlled most of the country and posed a potential base for the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. Cromwell landed in Ireland in August 1649 and conducted a brutal campaign that remains controversial to this day, characterized by massacres at Drogheda and Wexford that killed thousands of soldiers and civilians alike. The Irish campaign was driven by a toxic combination of religious hatred, vengeance for the 1641 massacres, and practical military logic that made terror an instrument of rapid conquest. Cromwell saw the Irish as papist savages who had murdered Protestant settlers, and he believed that severity now would prevent future bloodshed by breaking the will to resist. The result was a conquest that devastated Ireland, killed perhaps a quarter of the population through war, famine, and disease, and left a legacy of bitterness that endures to the present day. After Ireland came Scotland, where Charles II had accepted the covenant and been crowned king, providing a legitimate rival to the Commonwealth that had to be eliminated. Cromwell invaded Scotland in 1650, defeated the Scottish army at Dunbar in September despite being outnumbered to 2-1, and completed the conquest at Worcester exactly a year later, where Charles II narrowly escaped capture. By 1652, England, Scotland, and Ireland were united under a single republican government for the first time in history, a unification achieved through military conquest that would not outlast the regime that created it. The Commonwealth had survived its external enemies, but its internal problems were only beginning, as the army, parliament, and the religious radicals who had made the revolution possible increasingly found themselves at odds over the direction the new regime should take. The Rump Parliament proved to be as disappointing to the army and the godly as the king had been, failing to implement the religious and political reforms that the revolutionaries had expected from their victory. Instead of creating a godly commonwealth, the Rump seemed more interested in perpetuating its own power, delaying elections indefinitely while its members enriched themselves through corruption and patronage. Cromwell grew increasingly frustrated with the Rump's failures, and on April 20th, 1653, he stormed into the House of Commons with a file of musketeers and dissolved Parliament by force. "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately," Cromwell declared as he ordered the members out, in one of the most famous scenes of the English Revolution. He pointed at the mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority, and called it that fool's bauble, ordering a soldier to take it away as the members filed out in stunned silence. Cromwell's coup ended any pretense that England was a constitutional republic governed by parliamentary sovereignty, revealing that power ultimately rested with whoever controlled the army. The various experiments in government that followed the nominated assembly, the protectorate, the various written constitutions were all attempts to give legal form to military rule while satisfying the godly vision that had justified the revolution. In December 1653, Cromwell accepted the title of Lord Protector under a constitution called the Instrument of Government, becoming something like a military dictator with constitutional limitations that he could and did ignore when convenient. The Protectorate was neither monarchy nor republic, but a strange hybrid that satisfied no one fully, though it proved effective at governing England and projecting English power abroad. Cromwell was offered the crown in 1657, but ultimately refused it, unwilling to restore the institution he had done so much to destroy, though he was addressed as Your Highness and lived in the royal palaces with increasing ceremony. The Puritan Revolution that Cromwell led attempted to remake English society according to godly principles, which meant banning everything the Puritans considered sinful, frivolous, or connected to the popish corruptions of the past. The theaters were closed in 1642 and remained closed throughout the interregnum, as plays were considered immoral, distracting, and associated with the decadent court culture of the Stuart monarchy. Alehouses were strictly regulated, swearing was punished, adultery was made a capital offense, though rarely actually punished by death, and the Sabbath was enforced with unprecedented rigor. Most famously or notoriously, Christmas was banned, or at least the traditional celebration of Christmas was suppressed as a popish superstition without biblical foundation. The Puritans pointed out, correctly, that nowhere in the Bible was December 25th identified as Christ's birthday, and that the holiday's trappings, feasting, drinking, games, decorations owed more to pagan winter festivals than to Christian piety. Parliament declared Christmas a day of fasting and humiliation rather than celebration, and shops were ordered to remain open while churches were ordered to remain closed. Enforcement was spotty, but sometimes violent, as soldiers broke up Christmas gatherings, confiscated mince pies and plum puddings, and arrested ministers who insisted on holding services. The reaction to the Christmas ban revealed the limits of Puritan reform. Ordinary people resented having their traditions suppressed, and the attempt to impose godly discipline created more enemies than converts. Riots broke out in several towns when authorities tried to enforce the ban, and the unpopularity of the measure contributed to the broader disillusionment with Puritan rule that would eventually lead to the Restoration. The revolutionaries who had executed a king discovered that it was easier to cut off his head than to change the habits and pleasures of his former subjects. Oliver Cromwell died on September 3, 1658. the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, and with him died the only figure capable of holding the revolutionary regime together. He had been Lord Protector for less than 5 years, but in that time he had made England a major European power, projecting military force into the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the Spanish Netherlands in ways that rivaled the ambitions of any Stuart king. His foreign policy was expensive and not always successful, but it demonstrated that Republican England could compete with the great monarchies of Europe on equal terms. At home, Cromwell had struggled to find a constitutional settlement that could satisfy the army, the godly, and the political nation, experimenting with various forms of government without ever achieving stability. He had grown increasingly isolated in his final years, surviving assassination attempts, suppressing radical movements that had once supported him, and watching old comrades turn against what they saw as the betrayal of the revolution. When he died, probably of malaria combined with kidney disease, England faced the question it had avoided for nearly a decade. What came next? Cromwell's son Richard was named Lord Protector according to his father's wishes, but Richard lacked his father's military reputation, political skills, and force of personality. Tumble-down Dick, as his enemies called him, was a country gentleman who had never sought power and who was completely unprepared for the challenges of holding together a regime built on his father's prestige. The army grandees who had served under Oliver refused to take orders from his inexperienced son, and the various factions that Oliver had balanced against each other immediately began jockeying for advantage. Within 8 months, Richard had resigned, leaving England in a state of political chaos that seemed to have no solution except the one that everyone had spent 20 years trying to avoid. The 18 months between Richard Cromwell's resignation in May 1659 and the return of Charles II in May 1660 were a period of extraordinary confusion, as various factions competed for power and the country lurched from one provisional government to another. The Rump Parliament was recalled, then dissolved. The army intervened, then split into competing factions. Generals marched and countermarched while the civilian population watched in bewilderment and growing anger. The fundamental problem was that the revolution had destroyed the old sources of legitimacy without creating new ones that the political nation would accept. Parliament claimed to represent the people, but it had been purged, packed, and manipulated so many times that no one believed it actually reflected popular opinion. The army claimed to act for God and the public good, but its repeated interventions in politics had made it hated by civilians who resented military rule and military taxation. The religious radicals who had been the revolution's most fervent supporters were a small minority whose vision of godly reformation terrified the majority who just wanted to be left alone to celebrate Christmas and drink ale on Sundays. By the end of 1659, the only thing that most English men could agree on was that the current situation was intolerable and that something had to change. General George Monk, commander of the army in Scotland, provided the catalyst for change when he marched south in January 1660, ostensibly to restore order, but with intentions he kept carefully hidden. Monk was a professional soldier who had served both the king and parliament during the civil wars, and his political views were opaque even to those who knew him best. He entered London in February 1660, restored the members excluded by Pride's Purge to their seats in Parliament, and set in motion a process that everyone understood would lead to the return of the king. The Convention Parliament that met in April 1660 was elected on a relatively broad franchise and included many men who had supported the king during the civil wars but had been excluded from political life since his defeat. Charles II, who had been living in exile in the Netherlands, issued the Declaration of Breda, promising a general pardon, religious toleration, and settlement of all disputed questions by Parliament. The declaration was carefully crafted to reassure everyone, royalists that they would be rewarded for their loyalty, parliamentarians that they would not be punished for their rebellion, soldiers that they would receive their back pay, and religious dissenters that they would be protected. On May 8, 1660, Parliament proclaimed Charles II king, declaring that he had been the lawful sovereign since the moment of his father's death, and that the entire interregnum had been an illegal interruption of his reign. Charles entered London on May 29th, his 30th birthday, greeted by enormous crowds whose enthusiasm seemed to confirm that the Restoration was genuinely popular. The diarist John Evelyn recorded the scene. "I stood in the Strand and beheld it and blessed God. And all this was done without one drop of bloodshed, and by that very army which rebelled against him. The ease of the Restoration was itself a condemnation of the revolutionary regime," demonstrating how little support it had retained after 20 years of civil war, military rule, and godly reformation. The king had returned, and with him came the bishops, the House of Lords, the Book of Common Prayer, and Christmas, all the things the Revolution had tried to abolish but had never been able to destroy in the hearts of the English people. The theaters reopened, women appeared on the English stage for the first time, and a reaction against Puritan severity set in that made the Restoration Court one of the most dissolute in English history. Charles, too, who had learned during his long exile that life was uncertain and pleasure should be seized when available, presided over a culture of excess that was the mirror image of everything the Puritans had tried to create. The Restoration settlement attempted to heal the wounds of civil war while establishing limits on royal power that would prevent future conflicts. The king was restored with his traditional prerogatives intact, but the most objectionable measures of his father's personal ruleship money, the Star Chamber, the prerogative courts remained abolished. Parliament retained the powers it had claimed during the Civil Wars, including exclusive authority over taxation and regular meetings that the king could not prevent. The religious settlement was less tolerant than Charles had promised at Breda, as the restored Church of England reasserted its monopoly and expelled ministers who would not conform to the Book of Common Prayer. The Act of Uniformity of 1660 required all clergy to be ordained by bishops and to use the prescribed liturgy, forcing out approximately 2,000 Puritan ministers who could not in conscience comply. These ejected ministers and their congregations became dissenters or nonconformists, second-class citizens who were excluded from public office, the universities, and many professions. The persecution of dissenters under Charles II was never as severe as the persecution of Puritans under his father, but it created a lasting division in English society between church and chapel that would endure for centuries. The Clarendon Code, as the series of acts restricting dissenters was called, represented the revenge of the Anglican establishment on those who had humiliated them during the interregnum. The revolutionaries who had banned Christmas now found their own religious practices banned, their meetings broken up by soldiers, and their ministers imprisoned for preaching without licenses. John Bunyan, the author of The Pilgrim's Progress, spent 12 years in Bedford jail for refusing to stop preaching, becoming a symbol of dissenting perseverance under persecution. The question of what to do with those who had actually killed the king was more complicated, and the answer revealed much about the nature of the Restoration settlement. Charles II had promised a general pardon in the Declaration of Breda, with exceptions only for those whom Parliament should specifically exclude, and Parliament proved willing to exclude only a limited number of the most prominent regicides. Of the 59 men who had signed Charles I's death warrant, 13 had already died, and several others had fled abroad beyond the reach of English justice. Those who surrendered and threw themselves on the king's mercy were generally spared execution, though many spent the rest of their lives in prison. But those who were captured or who refused to surrender faced trials that were essentially predetermined, with conviction and execution the inevitable outcome. 10 regicides were executed in October 1660, subjected to the full horrors of the punishment for high treason, hanging, drawing, and quartering, a process designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. They were hanged until nearly dead, then cut down, castrated, disemboweled while still alive, and finally beheaded and cut into quarters, with the pieces displayed as warnings to others who might contemplate treason. The regicides faced their deaths with courage, proclaiming that they had acted according to their consciences and that God would vindicate them in the end. Thomas Harrison, the first to die, declared from the scaffold that I have served a good Lord and Master who will now reward me, before being subjected to the gruesome punishment that awaited him. The executions were popular with the London crowd, which had little sympathy for the men who had killed their king and banned their Christmas, but they also created martyrs whose memories dissenters would cherish. The most remarkable act of posthumous vengeance was reserved for Oliver Cromwell himself, whose body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey on the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution. Cromwell's corpse, along with those of Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, was dragged to Tyburn, the traditional place of execution for common criminals, and hanged on the gallows until sunset. The bodies were then beheaded, and the heads were placed on poles outside Westminster Hall, where they remained for over 20 years, gradually withering away in the English reign. Cromwell's head was eventually blown down in a storm and passed through various hands over the following centuries, becoming a macabre curiosity that was displayed at sideshows and private collections. It was finally buried in a secret location at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge in 1960, more than 300 years after Cromwell's death. The desecration of Cromwell's remains revealed the depth of royalist hatred for the man who had done more than anyone else to destroy the old order, but it also demonstrated the limits of what vengeance could accomplish. The revolution could not be undone by digging up corpses and hanging them in chains. The changes that Cromwell and his allies had wrought in English society and politics were permanent, regardless of what was done to their physical remains. The England that emerged from the Restoration was not the same as the England that had existed before the Civil Wars, and it never would be again. The divine right of kings had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover, even though Charles II reigned and his brother James would succeed him. The precedent had been established that kings could be held accountable, that Parliament could resist royal tyranny, and that the people, or at least the propertied classes who claimed to speak for them, had rights that even the crown must respect. The legacy of the English Revolution remained contested for centuries, with different groups claiming it for different purposes. Whigs celebrated the Revolution as a defense of English liberties against Stuart tyranny, seeing in Pym and Hampden, and even Cromwell, the ancestors of their own struggle against royal prerogative. Tories condemned the Revolution as a criminal rebellion against lawful authority, a cautionary tale about what happened when the mob was unleashed and traditional hierarchies were overthrown. Radicals saw in the Levelers and Diggers and other movements of the 1640s the ancestors of their own demands for democracy, equality, and social justice. Conservatives saw in the chaos of the interregnum proof that traditional institutions and gradual reform were preferable to revolutionary upheaval. The execution of Charles I continued to resonate through English history, invoked whenever questions of royal power, parliamentary sovereignty, or the rights of the people were debated. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Parliament deposed James II and invited William of Orange to take the throne, was in some ways a replay of 1649 without the bloodshed and radicalism. This time there was no trial, no execution, no republic, no Cromwell, just a quiet replacement of one king with another and a constitutional settlement that established parliamentary supremacy once and for all. The Bill of Rights of 1689 and the subsequent development of constitutional monarchy owed much to the lessons learned during the civil wars about the dangers of both royal tyranny and revolutionary excess. England would never again execute a king, but neither would English kings ever again attempt to rule without Parliament or to impose their will without consent. The banning of Christmas, which had seemed so significant at the time, became a footnote to the larger story, a symbol of Puritan excess that was largely forgotten once the holiday was restored. But the Christmas controversy reveals something important about the limits of revolutionary transformation. You can change laws and institutions relatively easily, but changing the customs and pleasures of ordinary people is far more difficult. The Puritans who banned Christmas genuinely believed they were doing God's work, purify English society of pagan and popish corruptions that distracted people from true piety. They were wrong, not in their theology necessarily, but in their assumption that ordinary people would welcome having their traditions abolished by zealots who knew better than they did. The resentment that the Christmas ban generated was out of proportion to its actual significance, but it captured something essential about the Puritan Revolution: its tendency to impose a minority vision on a majority that didn't share it. This was the fundamental contradiction of the Revolution. It claimed to act in the name of the people while suppressing the pleasures and traditions that ordinary people actually valued. The army that fought for liberty ended up imposing a military dictatorship. The parliament that resisted royal tyranny became tyrannical itself. The godly who sought reformation created a regime so hated that the monarchy was welcomed back with open arms. The failure of the Puritan Revolution was not inevitable, but it was rooted in the impossibility of imposing godly reformation on an ungodly society that didn't want to be reformed. When Cromwell died and his regime collapsed, what fell was not just a government, but a dream, the dream of building a new Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. The English people chose Christmas over the Commonwealth, the king over the protector, the traditional pleasures of life over the austere demands of the saints. What lessons can we draw from this extraordinary period of English history when a nation cut off its king's head, banned Christmas, and then welcomed the king's son back with cheering crowds? The first lesson is about the danger of political and religious extremism, and the way that revolutionary movements tend to devour themselves. The men who made the English Revolution began by defending traditional liberties against royal encroachment. They ended by creating a military dictatorship more arbitrary than anything the Stuarts had attempted. The parliamentarians who went to war to preserve the ancient constitution ended by abolishing the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the established church, the very institutions they had claimed to be defending. The godly who sought religious freedom ended by persecuting those who disagreed with them, closing theaters, banning festivals, and attempting to impose their vision of piety on everyone. Each escalation seemed justified by the circumstances of the moment. Each radical step seemed necessary to secure the gains of the previous steps, until the revolutionaries found themselves in a place they had never intended to go. The lesson is that revolutions are easier to start than to stop, and that the logic of revolutionary struggle tends toward extremism even when the original goals were moderate. The second lesson is about the importance of legitimacy in sustaining political authority, and the difficulty of creating new sources of legitimacy when old ones have been destroyed. The Stuart monarchy, for all its flaws, rested on centuries of tradition, religious sanction, and popular acceptance that gave it a stability the revolutionary regime could never achieve. When Parliament executed the king, it destroyed the source of its own legitimacy, since Parliament had always existed as a partner to the crown, not as a replacement for it. The various constitutional experiments of the interregnum, the Commonwealth, the Protectorate, the various written constitutions all failed because they lacked the foundation of popular acceptance that legitimate government requires. Cromwell could win battles and project power, but he could never create a regime that people would accept as rightful and permanent. When he died, his regime died with him because it had no source of legitimacy beyond his personal prestige and the army's bayonets. The Restoration succeeded not because Charles II was a better ruler than Cromwell, but because hereditary monarchy was a principle that most English people understood and accepted. The third lesson concerns the relationship between religious conviction and political action. and the dangers that arise when people believe they are doing God's work. The Puritans who made the Revolution were sincere believers who genuinely thought they were building a godly society that would please their Creator and prepare England for Christ's return. This conviction gave them courage and determination, but it also made them intolerant of opposition and unable to accept that others might sincerely disagree with their vision. When you believe you are doing God's work, compromise becomes apostasy, opponents become servants of Satan, and moderation becomes betrayal of divine commands. The religious intensity that made the revolution possible also made it impossible to sustain, because a society cannot permanently maintain the level of fervor that revolutionary transformation requires. The English people were not opposed to religion, but they were opposed to having religion imposed on them by zealots who claimed to know God's will better than they did. The failure of Puritan Reformation demonstrated that lasting religious change must come from within, from genuine conversion and personal conviction, not from laws and soldiers and the suppression of Christmas celebrations. The fourth lesson is about the relationship between military power and political authority, and the dangers of allowing armies to become political actors. The new model army was created to win the Civil War, and it succeeded brilliantly, but in succeeding it became a power in its own right that could not be controlled by civilian authority. Pride's purge, Cromwell's dissolution of the rump, the various military interventions during the interregnum demonstrated that ultimate power rested with whoever commanded the army. This was a dangerous precedent that the Restoration settlement was designed to prevent from recurring. The standing army that Cromwell had created was largely disbanded after 1660, and English political culture developed a profound suspicion of military power that would persist for centuries. The principle that the military must be subordinate to civilian authority, that soldiers must not interfere in politics, became a cornerstone of English constitutional development. This principle was not always honored in practice, but it remained the ideal, a lesson learned from the bitter experience of military rule during the interregnum. The final lesson is perhaps the most fundamental, that political settlements must accommodate human nature as it actually is, not as reformers wish it would be. The Puritans who banned Christmas assumed that people would be grateful to be freed from popish superstitions and would embrace a purer form of worship. They were wrong, because they misunderstood what Christmas meant to ordinary people, not theology, but community, not doctrine, but celebration, not purity, but joy. The revolutionaries who executed the king assumed that people would embrace republican government once they were freed from monarchical tyranny. They were wrong because they misunderstood how deeply the institution of monarchy was embedded in English culture and consciousness. The godly who sought to impose reformation assumed that people wanted to be reformed, that they would welcome the suppression of their vices and the elevation of their virtues. They were wrong because most people do not want to be reformed. They want to be left alone to live their lives according to their own lights. Successful political systems are those that accommodate human nature rather than trying to transform it, that work with the grain of culture rather than against it. The English Revolution failed because it demanded more than human nature could sustain, because it tried to create a new kind of person as well as a new kind of government. The events of 1649 cast a long shadow over English history, shaping political culture in ways that persisted long after the specific circumstances were forgotten. The English developed a horror of civil war and revolution that made them prefer gradual reform to dramatic transformation, compromise to confrontation, tradition to innovation. The glorious revolution of 1688 succeeded where the Puritan Revolution had failed because it was not really revolutionary at all. It was a palace coup dressed up in constitutional language, a change of rulers without a change of system. The English pride themselves on their political stability, their ancient institutions, their evolutionary approach to change, and this self-image was forged in the crucible of the civil wars. The memory of what happened when Englishmen turned their swords against each other, when the king's head fell into the basket, when Christmas was banned and theaters were closed, served as a warning against the dangers of political extremism. But the memory also served as an inspiration for those who believed that unjust authority could be challenged, that tyrants could be held accountable, and that the people had rights that no king could take away. The execution of Charles I was a crime in the eyes of those who believed in divine right, but it was a precedent in the eyes of those who believed in popular sovereignty. Every subsequent struggle for political rights in England and eventually in America and France and around the world drew in some way on the example of the men who put their king on trial and cut off his head. Today, the English civil wars seem like ancient history, as remote as the Wars of the Roses or the Norman Conquest. The issues that divided parliamentarians and royalists, the nature of the church, the rights of the king, the structure of society have been resolved or have simply ceased to matter. Christmas is celebrated with enthusiasm. The monarchy survives as a constitutional ornament, and no one proposes to close the theaters or ban alehouses. But the deeper questions that the civil wars raised are still with us. What is the source of political legitimacy? What are the limits of government power? When, if ever, is resistance to authority justified? The men who signed Charles I's death warrant believed they had answered these questions for all time, that they were building a new order that would last until Christ returned. They were wrong, but their questions remain, and each generation must answer them anew. The English Revolution was a failure in the sense that it did not achieve its goals, but it was also a success in the sense that it changed the terms of political debate forever. After 1649, it was no longer possible to argue that kings ruled by divine right without any accountability to their subjects. After 1649, it was no longer possible to deny that Parliament represented something real, that the people had rights, that power must have limits. The Revolution failed, but it also succeeded. It failed to create the godly commonwealth the saints had dreamed of, but it succeeded in destroying the old order that had made such dreams necessary. The head of King Charles I fell into the basket on that cold January morning, and nothing in England or the world was ever quite the same again.